Hello, this is Jayanta Chatterjee from IIT Kanpur. For last 8 weeks, we have been interacting on managing services and the contemporary issues in today's world, where all businesses are more and more driven by the service logic. In the last lecture of this 8th week, I'm going to attempt to do 3 things. First of all, I'm going to discuss with you the topic of services as systems with a holistic approach. And I'm going to look at 2 types of services or 2 types of service businesses. One which is an incumbent business. That means that is a business which is already in service and has a certain market position. And I'm also going to discuss about a new service business. And in both cases, I'm going to discuss how one can take a holistic approach, a systems approach to managing the services business. Now, if we take an existing company, a company which is already in the service business and is doing a strategic audit, an assessment of where they are and where they can go, which are the different options available to them and how to evaluate those options. In individual sections, with respect to people, with respect to process, with respect to technology, with respect to positioning, we have discussed this very issue again and again. But today we are trying to put it all together, and I also want to at the same time give you some direction that how each one of these topics relate to chapters in the textbook. As you remember, this is your textbook, Services Marketing, published by Pearson, written by me and 2 of my co-authors, Professor Lovelock and Professor Witz. And we have been referring to the 7th edition, which is currently available. And I would encourage all of you who have attended even some of the sessions, if not all the sessions, to register for the examination, because I think you can now go back to some of the lectures. You have that option, and you can refer to the textbook. With the help of today's discussion, you will know that how to go through the book, in what sequence, and you will find the examination quite easy to tackle. The examination will mostly have some multiple choice questions and some questions demanding short answers. And I'm quite sure from the quality of the various submissions that I have reviewed, which are already available on the forum, that most of you will do quite well at the exam. So best of luck, and let's review then in the context of strategic service vision these points, that what are the characteristics of important market segments. So you remember we had a lot of discussion on segmentation, targeting and positioning, or creating the strategic value proposition, which is a better way to look at this positioning the service. So to answer these questions for an incumbent service, that what are the characteristics of the addressed market segments, what needs are special to those market segments, how are those needs being met today, and how they can be served better, how those market segments can be served better. These fundamental questions, you should read chapter 1 and chapter 2 to get a better depth, go through many of the examples which are discussed in the book to supplement the discussions that we have already had in the early part in week 1 and week 3. Service concept. So we could have started with this, the service concept, but as you know, we have always been propagating in this particular course that start with the customer. That's why we actually talked about the customer segment served, and served with what kind of strategic value proposition and what can be done better. The next question that will emerge out of that, therefore, what is the service concept that is being offered? So the service concept, and particularly the importance of access, convenience, customer delight, the excellence at touch points, understanding that touch points can also be failure points as well as can be very important recovery points, how failures can be converted into an opportunity for developing relationship. And that's the reason why those touch points and that occasions of customer coming in touch with the front face of the service business as moments of truth. Now, all of these issues are relating to that, what are the important elements of the service that are to be provided, that are being provided, stated in terms of the results, because if you remember, we had started by saying that nobody is interested to buy a product or a service. Customers are looking for meeting a need, resolving a problem. So this, in terms of the results, if the service elements are viewed, remember that flower of service which we have talked about to understand the architecture of the service, the core and the petals. And we had also discussed that the results for customers are intricately linked to the challenges for the employees. We had discussed those specific problems of frontline service employees, like emotional labor, like the borderlessness of service, or like the multiplicity of demands, the role and the script that are developed in response, all of those. So chapter 2, 3 and 4 will be also then related to these questions. In addition to the discussions in the book, we had an extensive discussion here on service logic that is the dominant concept for all businesses today. And then we had also discussed, using the cues from chapter 2, 3 and 4, that what efforts are therefore needed for improvement in which the service is designed, delivered and marketed. So these two slides therefore take us from chapter 1 to chapter 4. We can look at the focus on service operations, that is the process, the delivery, the people in interaction, the service environment and all of those issues. So therefore, we had briefly discussed, and I will discuss at the end of this session, while discussing the operating strategies, I did discuss about new service development, but I will talk about it again today. At this moment, if we look at only incumbent service businesses, operating service businesses, then under this section covered by chapters 5, 8 and 9, we have been looking at the synergy between the organization's capability, service capability and the market opportunity, out of which is design of the service business decided with respect to operations, structure, human resources control. Obviously, in operating strategy, we have to decide the comparative resource allocation, and in this respect we had discussed number of ways we can decide upon the priorities for resource allocation. We had also discussed the role of the competition. We did not discuss a competitor action and reaction driven strategy. We had taken more the strategy driven by the quality of service, relentless lowering of cost, productivity and those issues. So the game theoretic perspective of managing service businesses, where we look at competitors' actions and strategic responses that can be given by your service business. This game theoretic approach was not discussed in depth. Perhaps in a future advanced course, we will look at these and other more data-driven, analytics-driven service business strategies. We spent a lot of time on service delivery system in terms of both process and process people interaction. We discussed about the important features, not only with respect to role of people and that interaction, but also technology and how people process and technology form a certain kind of troika which are interactively creating new different types of service improvements as well as creating new services altogether. We discussed some of those examples in the previous session. We discussed a lot about demand versus capacity issues and how this big challenge in the service business, that means indeterminate or often unpredictable demand, and the service capacity and operation strategies to meet that variability. Remember our discussion on variable pricing, yield management, and I would recommend that chapter 8 and 9 be reviewed to get a better understanding of what we have discussed and in the sessions and what are the supplementary points. So combine the session discussions with the chapter 8 and 9 to get a good in-depth understanding of these issues like relationship and advocacy that can arise by co-opting the customer at both the input end of the service process as well as the output end. We had a specific discussion on service design and how customers can be co-opted in the beginning of the value chain as well as the end of the value chain, and how those co-options can actually complete the loop. So remember that discussion based on the models proposed by Professor Prahlad and Ramaswamy. We had discussed a lot about the problems with respect to low entry barrier in service business, or low switching cost, due to hyper competition, and therefore we had discussed a lot about customers' lifetime value and understanding customers of different cost levels so that we can match different service levels. So, service level and customer value matching. We had discussed the problems relating to standardizing service due to those characteristics of service like the intangibility and heterogeneity and so on. But we had also discussed the response strategy where we create standard modules. So, module 1, module 2, module 3, module 4, and how these modules of standards can be combined and recombined to respond to different types of variability. One of the strategies that we discussed a little bit more in detail is this self-service or technology assisted service enhancement, and we had discussed that these modules being available, the combination of these modules can be done often through different types of automation to reduce the personal element or personnel element in the service delivery. But we had highlighted, however, that there are a number of different services where automation can be quite beneficial, but there are a number of other types of services where automation may actually be counterproductive. So, chapter 10 and 11 will be relevant for these competitive strategies that relate to overall cost leadership as well as the service strategy relating to differentiation. In the differentiation driven service strategy, obviously creating memorable, tangible occasions are very important. Different ways of customizing the standard service. So, we had discussed about this mass customization on demand, which is a good example of that are all these fast food joints, how they have standard blocks, and like whether French fries or burgers or pizzas, or which are almost available on semi-prepared level, and they can be combined and a lot of things can be added, like as a topping or as a sauce or as an ingredient, creating different service alternatives. We did discuss about in differentiation driven strategies the importance of personnel training and creating the confidence or projecting the confidence, creating the perception of solidity and dependability, so that that quality projection based on assurance, projection of reliability, creates this uniqueness of the brand image, service brand. So we discussed about the focus strategy also, how the focus can be done on the basis of a buyer group or service offered, like Arvind Eye Care, or geographic based focus like Delhi Metro or Mother Dairy, or a buyer group based service focus like say for service for creating residential blocks and services for Jal Vayu Sena, the Air Force and the Navy people. We discussed about what leads to customer preferences in spite of the IHIP, or rather arising out of these nature of service. We had discussed how these emerge as customers' preference criteria for services. In this respect, I would like to talk about, when we talk about price, please do read about a little bit more in detail about the elasticity, price elasticity, the concept of price elasticity, and variable pricing, yield management, topics that we have discussed in detail and also available in the book, chapter 12, 13 and 14. So each one of these, the importance of availability and convenience, dependability, which is also related to the ServQual 5 dimensions of tangibility, empathy, assurance, reliability and response level. So price and quality should be seen together. In fact, quality and reputation are quite connected. This also we had discussed, and so on. So in the service qualifier, or in the discussion of service quality, chapter 12, 13 and 14, I would also particularly request you to read the wheel of loyalty. This topic, wheel of loyalty, and that interesting diagram that is presented in the book, and we also showed it during our session. In the book, it is from page 354 to 362. In many ways, this particular diagram captures the key messages of this course on the best practices for managing services and the kind of services that will win. The concluding part of today's presentation will be this interesting research from 1991, but very, very valid even today after almost 25 years. This is the research paper by Chase and Hayes, published in the fall 1991 issue of Sloan Management Review, where they had looked at this 4-stage of, so this is the, you can say, service, business, maturity model. So at the lowest level, and it should be seen as this 1, 2, 3, 4, this should be seen as an ascending journey, 1, 2, 3, 4. So at the lowest level, where service businesses are just available for service, customers patronize the service because they may have no alternative, like the canteen at a student hall, because that's the only canteen that is available in the vicinity. So because of that convenience, high convenience factor, customers may patronize that service, not because their service is great. So here operation is often found to be quite reactive, and service quality is dominated by cost, and service quality can be quite variable. There is no predictability here. The next level is what is being called by Chase and Hayes as journeyman, where customers are sort of ambivalent towards this kind of service businesses. Here the operation is mediocre, there is nothing very inspiring. They meet some customer expectation and they may be good in 1 or 2 dimensions. Really, in this course, everything that we have discussed is for the journey towards this 3rd and 4th level, to develop distinctive competence, where customers will seek out the service company because of some sustained reputation that they have built up through those TEARR elements to create a record of customer satisfaction, receiving customer referral. And we had also discussed that in the next level, this is the level which is world-class service delivery, called by Chase and Hayes, and we have called it customer advocacy level. So from our, I would say this is the relationship level, and this is the customer advocacy level. So from these transactional levels, this course has always talked about how to rise to this level where the operations continually excel. It is reinforced by personnel management and systems that support an intense customer focus. And from there it goes to the operation is almost self-learning and self-innovating. So the people at the front end, with the kind of structure, freedom, encouragement for innovation, they create new moments of high satisfaction at the touch points. So the moments of truth become moments of excellence. So in this, obviously, we are always trying to have our post-consumption perception much better than customer expectation. This is where we produce customer delight and improve continuously. In the same way, we can, these are all relating to the front side, or you can say customer facing side. But similarly in these, as we had discussed in service business for excellence, that servuction model is very important. The seamless connectivity and the same level of excellence at the front stage must be complemented by that same level of excellence at the back stage. So back office becomes as valued as the front office. It plays an integral role. Often operations actually drive the excellence at the front level. So that's why, if you remember, we had discussed that in service business often operational excellence is the best marketing. So whether it is the workforce from a negative constraint going to efficient resource, they become the innovative creation fountainhead. In introduction of new technology in these, the third and fourth level, we see a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach to technology. So technology is not thrust upon these organizations due to competitive pressure, but they create new service levels by adopting technology ahead of the competition. So we see that in good banks, we see that in good food and beverage outlets, we see that in good healthcare services and so on. So right from the front touch point to the top management level, we see therefore this journey from just being available for service to the world-class service, going through the process of loyalty and relationship building to the level of customer advocacy. Now I'll take your maybe just 5 extra minutes to discuss with you we have discussed these points separately, but I will quickly go through 5-step process for creating a new excellent service business. So first start with what is the pain that you are trying to address? What is the customer pain that you are trying to address? What is the problem that you are trying to solve? So start with the customer, voice of the customer, study of the customer, empathy for the customer. So create an empathy map. And so instead of creating a service and then looking at the customer, look from customer perspective. So look from customer's perspective, what is needed, what sort of service is needed. So start from this end. Map with empathy the customer pain and what resolution you can provide. And in trying to frame this design question, designing this new service, you can also try to visualize the impact that you're trying to have. At this stage, you can have some number of solutions, but try to write the solutions and the corresponding contexts. So solution space, where there can be 1, 2, 3 alternatives, and match that with the context space. When you do this, you may have to revisit your original question. From this exercise, which is starting with empathy for the customer, an empathetic probe into the customer's problem, visualizing the possible solutions, the context for each possible solution, then select at the most 3 insights, really based on what if. So we are trying to first understand what is the customer problem, what is the customer pain, and then here we ask what if. From these what ifs, we can then develop maybe 3 themes of solutions, 3 themes of service business design, 3 themes of service value proposition, which we can describe in maximum 3 sentences. And then we can put it together by first creating a persona of the customer we are trying to target. So don't think of customers at this stage as numbers, as percentages, as age groups, not in terms of numbers. Give a face, draw a sketch. Draw a sketch of the customer. Understand that what is the need of this young teenager girl, and have some description of the person, understand the frustration and your motivation for service. This is an interesting way of also suggested by many design gurus. It's a way of design thinking application. They just write a small blurb, 1 or 2 sentence, 3 or 5 words, which will be typical for this customer persona that you are trying to develop. This is actually giving a whole view to your target customer. So you have created, therefore, 3 alternative themes of the new service business. You have given a shape and a personality to your target customer. Now you can say, okay, this is the customer, and for this customer, I have this bunch of value proposition. And then of course, you can do some further interviews and then develop a storyboard that what is today and what if, and resulting into the new service proposal or new service design. So this is a little 5 minutes add-on to service business management, and perhaps this whole approach of design thinking and its application to new products, new service, new business development, new venture creation will be another course where we will meet again. I hope you enjoyed this course as much as I enjoyed, and hope to see many of you registered for the examination, and enjoy. Good luck. Thank you.